Good morning, everyone. Hello and welcome to History Day. History Day is an annual event organised by the Institute of Historical Research in the Senate House Library. We welcome everyone with an interest of any sort in history. And among our audience, we usually have students, researchers, professionals from archives, libraries, and other organisations with history collections. Our theme this year is environmental history. And we have 4 wonderful speakers this morning for the first session. Session 1 is Collecting Nature and the Nature of Collecting. I'm Sophie Page, I'm a historian at UCL. We have 4 speakers who will give lightning talks about different aspects of collecting nature and the nature of collecting. We will be celebrating natural history collections and environmental history. We will also be reflecting on best practice for decolonising museum collections, and we will be thinking about how natural history collections respond to the current climate emergency and biodiversity crisis. Our 4 speakers have been asked to give lightning talks, so only about 5 to 8 minutes each, so we have a lot of time for questions. We'll have all the questions at the end. I will introduce each speaker in turn. You're very welcome to start putting questions in the chat. When the speakers have finished, we will probably move from a combination of questions in the chat to the raised hand question system, but moving to the chat if we run out of time. So thank you very much for coming. We have a large audience, which is great, and I look forward to your questions. So I'll introduce each speaker in turn before their talk. Our first speaker is Kat Harrington, who is an archivist at the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew. The library at Kew forms one of the most important botanical reference sources in the world, with collections from the 14th century, and supports research in a diverse range of academic disciplines. So I'll hand over to you now, Kat.
Thank you, Sophie. I'll just share my screen. Okay. Okay, can everyone see full screen? Lovely, thank you. So thank you very much to the organisers of the IHR History Day for the invitation to take part in this panel, and to Sophie for chairing and a kind introduction. So I'm part of a small team that cares for the archives at Kew, and Kew is a historic botanical garden, an internationally important research and education institution, and we're based in Surrey and in West Sussex in England, and in Antananarivo at the Kew Madagascar Conservation Centre. So Kew is home to over 360 scientists and 120 horticulturalists, and Kew's mission is to understand and protect plants and fungi for the well-being of people and the future of all life on Earth. We aspire to end the extinction crisis and to help create a world where nature is protected, valued by all, and managed sustainably. To this end, at the moment, we're really focused on 5 key priorities. So we will deliver science-based knowledge and solutions to protect biodiversity and use natural resources sustainably. We will inspire people to advocate for the natural world by promoting and providing access to knowledge, ideas, and beautiful gardens. We will train the next generation of expert scientists and horticulturalists. We will extend our reach and exist for everybody, disseminating our knowledge and collections physically and digitally for global benefit. And we will influence national and international opinion and policy and be an exemplar of environmental responsibility. So one of Kew's greatest strengths is the vast natural history collection that we have accumulated over the last 260 years. So the herbarium is one of the largest in the world, and it contains around 7 million pressed dried plant specimens. And alongside that are 76,000 plant specimens in alcohol. And together these form a vital inventory of plant life on Earth. Kew holds the world's largest fungarium, which is my favourite word, I love the fungarium, of over 1.25 million dried fungi specimens. And these underpin research into beneficial fungi, so things used in medicine, brewing, and for renewable fuels. And also they help us to examine detrimental fungi that cause plant diseases and have a huge impact in agriculture. The Millennium Seed Bank contains over 2 billion seeds and is the largest and most diverse wild plant genome bank in the world. And we have over 20,000 living species of plants growing in our gardens. And this makes Kew the most diverse kind of garden in the world and a powerful tool for restoring and conserving biodiversity and for inspiring the public. The Economic Botany collection is an extraordinary range of over 100,000 artifacts, and these are all derived from plant and fungal materials. And these inform our understanding of using natural products sustainably and can help us to facilitate important conversations about Kew and Britain's colonial legacy. Finally, our library, archives and botanical art collection support all aspects of contemporary scientific research at Kew. The library contains over 300,000 monographs and 5,000 different journal titles. We also hold 4,600 archive collections, and over 200,000 botanical illustrations. These collections offer the primary and secondary materials through which we can understand the development of botanical and conservation science and provide supporting context for the collections at Kew. Although originally compiled for very scientific aims, these collections provide a rich resource for all manner of arts, humanities and social science research. And these collections are open to all, we're open to the general public, and we encourage you to get in touch with us to find out more about our collections and to see how they may assist your research. So it's really important to understand how these vast collections have been amassed, by whom and to what ends at Kew. So Kew began life as a royal residence and it was founded, well, we take the foundation date as being 1759, and that's when Princess Augusta established a kind of small physic garden on the site. Under Augusta's son, King George III and Queen Charlotte, Joseph Banks became the first unofficial director and helped Kew to become embedded at the centre of the Enlightenment project of voyages of exploration and appropriation of the natural world. Gardens moved to government control in the 1840s and became a botanical arm of the British government. And then they had an explicit role in economically viable plant commodities. Kew facilitated the transfer and trial of medicinal and agricultural plants, primarily within the British colonies, including rubber, cinchona, tea, coffee, and cacao. Today, Kew works in the frameworks of the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Nagoya Protocol and CITES to do with the trade of endangered species. We undertake all our work in partnership with other countries through bilateral agreements. And these agreements focus on principles of access and benefit sharing, with concepts of prior informed consent, joint field work, and the exchange of data, results, and literature. I just wanted to briefly highlight a current pilot project in which a small team has been looking at case studies of specimen collection in the archives over time to better understand the transition from a colonial institute to a partnership-based approach. One case study is based around the plant collections made by former Kew director, Joseph Dalton Hooker in the Himalayas in the late 1840s. And the image on your screens is a really idealized version of Hooker on this collecting expedition. Hooker describes sitting for the original of this portrait, noting the artist, quote, is pleased to desire my sitting in the foreground, surrounded by my lepkas and the romantic looking Gurkha guard, inspecting the contents of a vasculum full of plants, which I have collected during the supposed day's march. More realistically, Hooker relied immensely on the knowledge, paid and unpaid labour and skills of the local people of the Sikkim Himalaya region, as well as much political wrangling in order to collect in these areas. Hooker's extensive correspondence survives and is currently being transcribed by a team of volunteers. It includes a letter in which we get a more realistic understanding of the context of his collecting. Please note the following quote uses terms which may be considered offensive. Hooker writes to his father, quote, I have just had a terrible mishap. 6 days ago, I sent my head lepka with 6 men to Tonglu for roots and rhododendrons and rhubarb, and as is customary, paid them beforehand. The poor fellows were stopped at the border, the coolies sent back, and my head man taken prisoner. In the summer of 2020, Kew joined many other organisations in considering its own position of privilege in the wake of the injustices highlighted by the Black Lives Matter movement. The extraction of wealth during the colonial era led to many of the structural inequalities present in our society today. We have started the process of self-reflection and identifying actions we must take to be a more equitable, inclusive organisation. This will be an ongoing process of listening and change at Kew. There are no quick fixes, and we will work in collaboration with our many existing partners to move forward. This slide captures a few of our current ideas for work within the library and archives. In yellow are research areas we would like to develop using the archive collections. In black are broad topics of consideration for us. One of our commitments is to re-examine our collections to explore exploitative legacies and to broaden the diversity of the stories we tell. Transparency over Q's history is important and will require detailed research into the archives and the collections themselves. For instance, there is much to discover from the archival silences in our records, the many unnamed botanical artists that created beautiful paintings and illustrations for the East India Company, and the unrecorded field assistants who located and collected so many specimens on our behalf. An important area for collections work in general at Kew is co-curation that returns knowledge and resources to communities in meaningful and beneficial ways. And this is an area in which Kew already has much experience, built upon a focus on ethnobotanical research. I'd like to leave you with a quick quote from our Director of Science. By opening up our collections and practices, we will give voice to a past that includes troubled chapters, but one that will hopefully contribute to a brighter future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kat, for that very thoughtful introduction to the collections. So we will, please, everyone do put questions in the chat and we'll collect them all at the end. So in the interests of time, I will now move to our second speaker, Abby Hoverstock, who is Senior Archivist at the Denver Public Library Conservation Collection. This is a really important archive for the 20th century environmental conservation movement in the United States. Established in 1960, and several important environmental organizations have since designated the Denver Public Library as their official repository for their archives. So we look forward very much to hearing about it now.
Thank you very much for including me this morning. I'm very happy to be joining you from Denver, Colorado. It's a bit early for me this morning, about 5 o'clock, so bear with me as I get my bearings. I'm pleased to tell you a little bit generally about our conservation collection at Denver Public Library this morning. So a snapshot of who we are. We are a large urban public library system. Denver Public Library provides welcoming spaces where everyone is free to explore, learn, create, and belong. And this is a mission that we take really seriously. Being a free space for everyone, we're prepared to serve a wide variety of customers, regardless of age, experience, or research skills. We've got 26 branches in our system throughout neighborhoods in Denver, and a busy central library where the department I work in is located, the Western History and Genealogy Department. And it's unusual in the United States to have such a large archival collection inside a public library. You're much more likely to find such a collection at a college or a university or a large state historical museum. We've got over 5,000 manuscript collections. So this little inset map shows Colorado, located within the Inter-Rocky Mountain region, if you're not familiar with it. We do consider ourselves a Western state. And our manuscript collecting areas are rather diverse. Conservation is only one of them. And I'm always interested in, how we find ourselves needing to tweak our collecting focus within each of these collecting areas sometimes in order to be sustainable and relevant for the present and the future. Sometimes our collecting areas intersect quite a bit. You can have a collection that's both a conservation collection and is also relevant to other collections, for example. So the founding of our collection. The conservation collection was founded in 1960 by a man named Arthur Carhart. He had served in World War I and worked as a landscape architect and a recreational engineer for the US Forest Service. One of his first assignments was to design a layout of roads and cabin sites around Trappers Lake, which is located in Northwest Colorado. That's the image that you see in the center here. He went to visit to try to lay out a development plan for this beautiful space. And he returned actually advocating that the land be left undeveloped. His supervisor agreed, and Trappers Lake would become the first designated wilderness area in Colorado a few years later. So Carhart was really a conservation champion from the kind of early years of his career. He became a full-time writer of environmental fiction, and some of the topics he was interested in that were themes throughout his work were public land use, wildlife management, and wildfire mitigation. Later in his life, in 1960 or just before, Carhart searched for a library for his books and archives. And he learned there wasn't one that he could donate his materials to. So with the city librarian, John Eastlake, he created the conservation collection at Denver Public Library. He became a passionate champion of the collection, advocated for it nationally, and even envisioned it being the preeminent North American conservation collection. Part of Carhart's quote here in 1962 reads, "What we know and do in conservation will determine whether or not people and nations of the earth will continue to exist." And certainly that quote is as true today as it was in 1962. Our conservation collection really contains the underpinnings of the conservation movement in the United States as it was gaining momentum in the 1960s. At this time, there was a real looming threat of technology, that technology would increase the chasm between people and the natural world. Pollution and overpopulation were real everyday threats in people's minds. Rachel Carson's seminal Silent Spring was published in 1962. And a couple of years later, President Johnson would sign the Wilderness Act, which would establish wilderness designation for the first time, and it would preserve 9.1 million acres of federal land. Here's Carhart with a couple of the early acquisitions for the conservation collection, which included, just 3 examples, the American Bison Society records, whose members rallied to save the American bison from extinction, also known as the American buffalo, and they promoted bison breeding programs that were successful across the country. The Wilderness Society records, of course, from the founding documents to the records that come out of present-day regional offices. And another example is Rosalee Edge papers. She was a bird conservation activist and founder of the Hawk Mountain Sanctuary in Pennsylvania. She was influential in creating waterfowl protections and hunting regulation, and hers is a good example of those early conservation collections exhibiting the alliances between conservationists and hunters, which was such an important connection for preserving land so that it could be used if for starters to continue to hunt species. More recent acquisitions have included a slightly more diverse and contemporary set of records. We've got over 200 manuscript collections within the conservation collection now. But we know for the most part, our conservation collections are concentrated around early to mid 20th century, and they're overwhelmingly about white people, and they're mostly about men. We realize our collections don't tell the whole story of American conservation. So what has changed since the collection's inception and today? Well, before the internet, I think the Conservation Library was built to be really a public resource center for environmental activists. But now the collection is more likely to support scholars and environmental historians. Is the scope too large? This is something we struggle with as a national or even international in scope collection. Is that something we can sustain? And can we meet new user expectations? People expect digital content and lots of it at their fingertips. And so we're exploring new partnerships with a publisher of digital databases and primary sources to begin digitizing complete collections, which is fairly new for us. And organizationally, we are committed to equity, diversity, and inclusion, and to viewing all of our work through an EDI lens. To be a stronger collection in the future, we have embarked on a diversity audit to learn more about our existing collections. But this is across all collection areas. And this project actually began as a work from home project during the COVID closure. We recruited staff who were redeployed from across the library system to participate, which was fun. We could bring people in to learn more about collections. And essentially they look extremely closely at the metadata about each collection and pull out pieces of information that would be difficult for us to get with just a keyword search in our catalog. So where will the diversity audit take us? We don't know yet. The project is still in process. We're only about 35% complete at the moment, but we know that it will show the racial identities and geographical concentrations in our collection. We know that it will show the timeframes that our collection represent and the gender biases in our collection. It'll show gaps in our collecting areas. And I think it will prompt us to diversify what we acquire and eventually hire a more diverse team of archivists and librarians, I hope as well. Thank you very much for indulging me this morning. You can visit us online, search our finding aids, search our catalog, or email my colleagues and me, and possibly even visit us in person. We'd love to see you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for introducing us to such an interesting collection that many people will not, I'm assuming, have been aware of. Okay, so keep writing questions in the chat, please. Thank you for starting doing that. And I'll introduce our next speaker. Miranda Lowe is a scientist and curator at the Natural History Museum. She was the author of an important article, co-author of an important article 3 years ago, Nature Read in Black and White, Decolonial Approaches to Interpreting Natural History Collections, and has since been part of the Museums Association Decolonisation Working Group, who I understand will be shortly producing a document. So we were interested with this talk, particularly in what has changed in the in these last 3 years and what the possibilities for best practice are. Thank you.
Okay. Right, just going to share my screen. Great. Can everyone see that? Great. Just want to correct to slideshow. There we go. Right, everyone. Okay. So I'm just going to take you through what, well, as Sophie already mentioned about my paper, some of the examples within the paper and what does it mean to decolonize natural history, and where the NHM Natural History Museum and myself are kind of moving forward with their stories, and a lot of other people, because I've got a few updates for everyone. So I love showing this, and some of you may have seen this before in other talks that I've been giving, but my work over the last couple of years has been around whose voices are silenced, not heard or amplified within natural history collections. Who did the original collecting, other than some of the naturalists that we may be more well known, such as Charles Darwin or Alfred Russel Wallace, things like that, and the environment where things, because this, you know, the theme is about environmental history, the environment of where specimens were collected, whether, you know, what the current climate was, particularly what the landscape was like, what the environment was for those people actually collecting. And within this illustration you can see here, this is by Jean-Baptiste Debret, around the early 1830s, and he was French artist based in Brazil, and just shows the diversity of specimens that could be collected. But then when you look to see who's doing the collecting, are actually Black people, people of colour there, and what that means within our own natural history collections within museums. So one of the examples in my paper that Sophie mentioned, I talk about Hans Sloane. So he's well known in terms of founding the British Museum and also the Natural History Collections, which eventually moved from the British Museum in Bloomsbury to South Kensington. And I look here because, as well as Sloane being a botanist, a collector, a physician, naturalist, when he was in Jamaica, he did observe the enslaved Africans. So he spent many years there documenting that, as well as documenting the plants there. But there were enslaved Africans who were actually doing the collecting of some of the plants. I think, if I remember correctly, it's about over 890 plants that were collected at that point in time. And I've got in the central picture there an illustration of the cocoa. And that's really important for someone like me in terms of my African and Caribbean heritage, what that means culturally, as well as what it means scientifically and what it has meant to the world in terms of, the manufacturing of drinking chocolate and extending through to the chocolate kind of luxury sweets that we eat today. Another story that I amplify, and you can see an example within the center of this slide, is a painting of one of the, well, it's an image of the painting of one of 162 panels, botanical ceiling panels within the Natural History Museum's main hall, the Hinsey Hall, which is on the second level, second floor balconies just by the giant sequoia. And this example here illustrates where Gramon Quasi, the gentleman on the left, was actually not well known and not well recognized, but was acknowledged for his own botanical knowledge in the mid-1700s in terms of discovering and having indigenous knowledge about the medicinal properties of a plant called Quassia amara. So that plant was named after Gramon Quasi by Carl Linnaeus. It's quite intertwined, and if you're looking at this from perhaps a Surinese perspective, so Gramon Quasi was enslaved as a child, taken from Ghana and went to Suriname, where he learnt a lot of the how to use herbal remedies on people that were sick, that had intestinal parasites or had fever. This brewing the leaves of this plant would produce a bitter tea, but it would reduce the fever and get rid of the parasites. But it's controversial in the sense that he fought against the local Maroons in Suriname, so those indigenous people, alongside the Dutch. So Suriname at that point in time was colonized by the Dutch. Although he did use, he was considered a doctor in Suriname and did heal both the Dutch colonialists and the indigenous people there. But what I'm about in terms of my work is to recognize the contribution of Black people within natural history, how that has benefited all of us within the pharmaceutical industry for this plant, and what it would mean recognizing this person going forward. But also I understand that I'm telling, although I'm a Black female, I was born in the UK, and so I try to inform myself by listening to various perspectives, and so that's how I know that he may not be as celebrated in Suriname in terms of that colonial aspect. So here we have John Edmundson and the working relationship that he had with Charles Darwin. I've got a link here because there is a new blog, more enhanced information than the information that I had in my paper from 2018 now. And that is one of the things that I think moving forward, and I'm pleased to see that in the last 18 months, a lot of people have reread my paper or picked up my paper for the first time, and because of Black Lives Matter and the amplification of representation and inclusivity within the heritage and cultural sector, a lot of the stories and people are sourcing a lot more information is coming to light on databases. And through me and the discussion that we're going to have later on, it's also reaching not just people within my own discipline, sort of others, members of the public, other social historians. And so this recent blog on John Edmundson was published by Lisa Williams, who is the director of the Caribbean, the Edinburgh Caribbean Association. So do go and look that up. But essentially here, you know, most of us online here will know of Charles Darwin and what he meant to the naming of plants and animals and classification, self-taught zoologists. But for a very long time, not much was known about John Edmundson. He was previously enslaved in Guyana and became free and ended up in Edinburgh in Scotland. And he met Charles Darwin as a teenager who was supposed to be studying medicine. But Charles Darwin, because John Edmundson was teaching taxidermy at the university, Charles Darwin ended up paying John Edmundson to teaching taxidermy there. And because this is a lightning talk, I'll leave you to read that blog and more elements of that story. But again, it's recognizing a person of color that has, you know, passed on knowledge and skills to someone like the young Charles Darwin before he even went on the Beagle voyage as well at that point in time. So there, and I think I saw that somebody had posted the link to the paper. So that's the title of the paper that my co-author Subhadra Das and I wrote some years ago now. As a result of some of those examples that I've shown you there, I developed a tour just before, you know, before what we've been going through in the last 18 months. Actually, it was coincidental that a lot of the examples and characters within my paper, I was able to use one of the Hinsey Hall and the first floor balconies to actually amplify and tell this story through various specimens and also the Charles Darwin statue. You can see there in the picture to tell those stories. I also used, you know, bringing the cocoa bean with me so that people could smell that if they've never held and smelt a cocoa bean before, what that experience is like. And also, you know, bringing myself as a person of colour to this tour as well with other insights, not just my professional insights, but my cultural insights, which gives a more rounded and a holistic point of view of, within natural history. And just quickly, sort of things going forward in terms with my organisation, there's been a lot of talk around databases, and I've kind of amplified that conversation as well, because these, well, specimens or objects, and that is an interesting conversation as well. So these are embedded within the coral collection that I'm currently responsible for and do research on. If they were presented in the British Museum, they would be seen as objects, but they are seen as coral specimens. So coral specimens actually encrusting the bottle, the broken bottle, and small coral on this jug. But I'm very interested in the labels and where they were purchased from. So the one on the left was purchased at the Colonial Exhibition, which is labelled officially the Indian and Colonial Exhibition of 1886, which was held in South Kensington. So I'm investigating why this was purchased. Was it just for the bottle or was it for the coral? And the documentation I've enhanced on our collection management system because it didn't actually have in the right fields the colonial exhibitions that you could search front end. So there are all issues around databasing. And then the coral and the jug, the metal jug on the right-hand side is interesting because it was dived up in the 1860s from Port Royal in Jamaica. So again, investigating this, and it also does show us, and you know, we've got COP26 going on, you know, how long vessels and objects can last in the ocean as well, and what that can tell us, and what the coral can tell us as well about the environment. So these are some links to further information and catalogues. It's quite a huge catalogue about that exhibition at the time. And then I've been looking at links across collections. So this kind of work does take a long time. I will often see something at one part of the collection and then see something independently somewhere else and then make a connection. I only made this connection during the lockdown, but it's around Dr. Louis Leakey, who in his early 20s was on the East African expedition. And so the lobsters and the coral, so lobsters on the left and the coral on the right, were collected in that exhibition in 1924. And the lead on that exhibition was Dr. Cutler. And you can find the report online as well here. But what's interesting, a very short paper here. So what's not documented on our databases are the original peoples, so indigenous people from East Africa. And there is a picture in this paper that we're actually looking for fossils, for dinosaurs, but also as another element of the exhibition, the pastime was to collect other things that would show, indicate about how the environment was, such as the coral. And then lastly, we've got a new exhibition at the Natural History Museum, which is called Our Broken Planet, How We Got Here and Ways to Fix It. And in this case, so there are several voices, so the diversity of voices of museum scientists and curators throughout the exhibition. So I'm in there too. But this case is very interesting because it talks about the real price of sugar, the environmental impact, but also the historical impact of collection. And the book, so the illustration of the book that's open on the top left-hand corner, when you look at it in detail, it shows enslaved peoples from Haiti. They're actually collecting the cane. It shows the industrial process essentially, and the pressing of the cane. And they're being overseen by a planter with a gun. And so within that image, well, there's a lot of trauma through enslavement and how people were used, but also how the land was used. And through a conversation only just recently, a couple of days ago, we were talking about the use of the residue of the sugar cane, which is called bagasse. It's like a dry pulp that was used to mix with corals and other masonry to build for building. So I'll just leave it there, but it's a lot to talk about and to think about within this lightning talk, but thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. That was very rich and brought lots of perspectives in. And I encourage everyone to go and see the exhibition at the Natural History Museum. So moving on quickly in view of time, our fourth speaker is Dolly Jorgensen, who is Professor of History at the University of Stavanger. She's a historian of the environment from the medieval period to the present day, and has a particular research project at the moment on cultural histories of animal extinction. She's recently published Recovering Lost Species in the Modern Age, Histories of Longing and Belonging. And I'll hand over to Dolly now.
Thanks, Sophie. Thanks everybody for being here today to hear about these. My presentation is a little bit different because I don't work with just one collection as a researcher, but rather, as Sophie mentioned, I've been working on the issue of extinction broadly and how that is displayed and thought about in museums, how that's communicated with the public, and how we might do that better or differently. And so I thought I would just present one example of that based on an article that I have coming out later this month on museum collections, collecting, and the extinct Caribbean monk seal, which is probably an animal that you've never heard of. And that's actually what interested me when I found out that it was extinct. Because the Caribbean monk seal is actually the first mentioned in European accounts of the New World in 1494 on the second voyage of Columbus, when the men on the ship killed 8 seals who were sleeping on a rocky island. So they were the first large animals on land that were encountered by the Europeans in the New World. They were written about in the 1700s. The quote here is from Sir Hans Sloane, which we heard about earlier in a text from 1709. The Bahama Islands are filled with seals, he writes. Sometimes fishers will catch 100 in a night, and they try and melt them and bring off their oil for lamps to these islands. So it was known about as a species, but it took until the mid 1800s before one made its way into a museum collection. So in 1849, the keeper of zoology at the British Museum, which is now the Natural History Museum, which Miranda works for. So the keeper at the time, John Edward Gray, published a paper on some of the museum seal specimens, and it included the first ever description of the Caribbean monk seal. It was based on a skin. He didn't actually have any bones, but the skin had been from a seal caught off Jamaica by and given to or purchased by the naturalist Philip Henry Goss, who's also a very famous naturalist at the time. It took 36 years before another specimen showed up, and this one was acquired by a Cuban professor. And important to bring again the voices that do not come from the standard people into the story. So in 1883, Professor Philippe Puy de Allo of Havana gave the Smithsonian a mounted specimen. So that included the skull and leg bones. And so this was quite important for the first ever drawings. And you see that here of this specimen. So scientific drawings were made of the bones. But with those drawings being published then in 1884, an author and artist, Henry Elliott, with the Smithsonian Natural History Museum, published an article saying that he hoped, and this is his drawing on the left, saying that he hoped that publishing about the seal would, quote, stimulate the attention of one of the many fruit and sponge vessel owners now cruising in West Indian waters, who, detecting the presence of another specimen, may secure it and forward this rare and valuable trophy to those who would appreciate and preserve it. So this call is actually taken up by a purveyor of specimens of the time, Henry Ward, who had a big company that would provide natural history specimens. And he sends his son out to an expedition with the Mexican Natural History Division that worked in geography. And they were able to kill a whole group of specimens, and those actually make their way all over the world. So specimens that are in US institutions like Harvard and Smithsonian in Philadelphia, but also the British Natural History Museum and the Cambridge Zoological Museum, Naturalis, all have specimens from this expedition. A later expedition in the 1900s, we actually have the only known photographs of the Caribbean monk seal in the wild. Were taken as part of this expedition, and they're found in the Smithsonian archive. And in this expedition, which went out on behalf of the Smithsonian, 35 skulls and skins were delivered. So those make up the biggest collection of Caribbean monk seals. I won't get into all the details about it, but which you'll be able to read in my article, but the collection, during these collection processes, people knew that the seal was rare. They knew that the seal would likely go extinct, and they wanted to collect them before that happens. And so in so doing, contributed to the end of the Caribbean monk seal. Because the last hunt that we hear of is in 1911, which is described as about 200 monk seals on this little islands off of the Yucatan. And then it really doesn't show up again. it was listed as very rare in the 1960s, becomes listed as endangered in 1982. Finally, in 1986, it was classified as extinct with a question mark by IUCN, and then in 1994 made extinct as its listing. It took the US longer to come to that realization. What I found interesting when I look at these museums, and you can see the museum specimens here, because this is all we have of the Caribbean monk seal, is that museums actually don't display this animal. As far as I have been able to find, there's only one of the collections. This is the one in Harvard, which I'll actually go to see next week, that display these specimens. And yet they were, the museum collecting practices were part and parcel of the reason why this species became extinct in the end. Not that it wasn't a larger capitalist movement, because it was for their seal oil, but museums operated within the same logics of capitalism at the time to collect these specimens. So I think it's worth museums thinking about the ways in which we display those logics of capitalism in collections, and the ways in which they actually contain the only remnants of these species, which do not exist anywhere else. So I will have an article, as I said, forthcoming it's in a Portuguese journal of science that's dedicated to Latin American animal extinctions, and it's free, open access. So I'd encourage you to take a look at that. And if you want to know more about my museums and extinction work, I have a website for myself and for my specifically extinction projects that you're welcome to look at and contact me. Thanks.
Thank you very much for drawing attention to this interesting and upsetting story. It was great to have that insight, and for the link to your article. So we are up against the time. It's 11:50. The next History Day event isn't till 12:30, however, so if the speakers' time permits, we might go over a little bit to see it, just to fit all the questions in. What I suggest I do, I'm going to read the questions off the chat first, but I'm going to go from one for each speaker rather than start with all three for Kat, because I think that might just take up a lot of time and might be quite tiring for Kat as well. So I will just, so everyone's I will get to every question as long as our time permits, but let me just scroll up here. So I thought with Kat, I'd sort of pull together the points in the first two questions, which are from, and thank you everyone for posting in the chat, from Anna Briggs and Pauline Rutter, asking similarly questions about how you decolonize the organization and the collection at Kew. So asking about the diversity of staff, the relabeling of exhibits, and recataloguing, and what you do and how you do it.
Yeah. So we're very much at the start of this process, and we're working collaboratively, particularly with the Royal Botanic Gardens at Edinburgh, in understanding kind of the ways to work towards this. We've got a working group which involves staff from across the organisation. And in terms of the diversity of staff, it's quite a new area for us to examine our own diversity. So we launched a strategy just in 2020, in fact, and we've just appointed our first head of equality, diversity and inclusion, specifically looking to understand what our current diversity is. My understanding is that at the moment, our science staff in particular are underrepresented for groups, and that's very much an area that we want to focus on in the strategy in the next 4 years. So how do we get a more diverse makeup of staff in science? In terms of relabeling, that's a really interesting area. We're looking at how to talk more frankly about the history of botanical collecting. I'll pop into a chat, into the chat box, a podcast that our head of interpretation did. So what we've been doing at the moment is kind of doing sort of trial areas around the gardens, but we're going to actually undertake a sort of a kind of survey across the gardens of all the different kinds of interpretation and look at what's there, how could it be improved, how can we bring more diverse voices in, what communities can we speak to. In terms of our databases, it's a huge task. We have so many different science databases to kind of survey. So I'll be looking particularly within the library and archives, but I loved the idea of the diversity audit that Abby discussed. So I'll be chatting with her about how that was undertaken, because that's certainly something we need to do at Kew, I think. So it's a huge task, but we're working across the organisation. And there's a lot of momentum, which is wonderful. We're sort of setting short-term and longer-term goals. Some things will require a lot more research, particularly our sort of 20th century history is relatively little studied. So there's a huge scope for academics in that area. So yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thanks very much. So we'll come back to other questions for you, but if I can move for the moment to Abby. And Abby, there's a question from Sandra wanting to hear more about Rosalee Edge.
Yes, and thanks. Somebody included a link to a fairly current piece in the Marginalian about Rosalee Edge, which was really nice. She's actually been written about quite a bit. Rosalee Edge must have been somebody that Arthur Carhart knew personally. And I think what's so interesting about the really strong collections that we have came because he had a personal connection, a business connection with these individuals that he was really able to get these exquisite collections to Colorado. Rosalee Edge is an interesting collection from a feminist perspective, from kind of a privileged Anglo perspective. So many of these early conservationists, I think, came with either the ability to work in the conservation movement because they didn't have to labor elsewhere. They had connections politically very often, were politically powerful in some way, or culturally powerful in some way. And so they were able to have influence. And I think that was particularly important for women conservationists in order to even be taken seriously in the field of conservation, to have the type of power that they would need to actually affect change. So it's a really wonderful collection. There have been a couple of biographies written about her, and they're out there and available if you're interested. I recommend them. I know they've used our papers in order to craft those biographies. I hope that helps a little.
Thank you. We have a question from Miranda from Pauline Rutter. Miranda, do you write about the emotional and relational responses you have personally to the objects and exhibits you handle and the new visibility of the histories that have previously been obscured and erased?
I'm in the process, and I'm sure Pauline, while she asked the question, it's very difficult to do that. Most of the time I work in a storeroom on my own when I discover these things. So I'm like, oh my God, those kind of moments. But yeah, so it's in the process of writing about it, but very difficult. And with that being said, it's where I will make myself most vulnerable in a professional community, which I'm not used to in that way. So yeah, but something is in process. Yeah, it's difficult. That's all I can say. It's difficult with my heritage as well. And everybody's been talking about, how diverse the sector is, and I know it's not very diverse at all. And I've been in the sector. I'm actually celebrating an anniversary, if anyone's following me on Twitter, 30 years at the museum. So, and that's a celebration, but also very shocking that, there were just very few of people like me across the board. But anyway, thanks for the question.
Thank you very much for that response. I have a question from Robert Aldacker. This is for all the speakers, but perhaps we can start with Dolly's response. A general question: in terms of finding primary sources, you might expect the sources to be held in museums of the colonizing nations. Miranda gave a good example of information from Suriname being held in the UK Natural History Museum, when you might expect it to be in Suriname or the Netherlands. Dolly also spoke about expedition specimens being held in several countries. Are the existing databases good enough to find relevant primary sources?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really good observation, which is that when I've looked at extinction, what you find is that most specimens of extinction are, they occurred in colonized places around the world, colonized by Europeans, and Europeans were directly responsible for leading to their extinction in modern extinctions, right? So we're talking from 1500 on. And those bodies then of those extinct things, the remains of those, are held in those colonizing nations. So if you want the best collections of extinct animals, you'll go to the Natural History Museum in London, you'll go to Naturalis in Leiden, you go to the Natural History Museum in Paris, to the Smithsonian, and to the American Museum of Natural History in New York. Are the databases good enough? There are some specific databases that help you find specimens, and if you're dealing with, as I have, with mammals and birds, they're quite good. The GBIF database, which finds occurrences, and a lot of museums have uploaded their data, so that if I search for an extinct thing, I can find who has it. And a lot of those institutions now, like the Natural History Museum in London, like Harvard, they've scanned in the records, so they're the logbooks of the specimens as they've been logged, so that when I go and I see, oh, that person has a Caribbean monk seal, I can actually see both the record that they have now, but also the original log entry, and what it says. So from that perspective, I think it's pretty good amount of data to find out where something is held, of the types of things that I'm dealing with. Now, the smaller you get and the more proliferation there is, the harder it gets. But with extinct things, to be honest, there aren't going to be so many specimens. Even the most common things like the passenger pigeon and the thylacine, which most museums of any size will have one in their collection, there's still not that many. So.
Thank you. Would any of the other speakers like to respond to that as well? So it was a question for everyone. No? Thank you. So I'm going to go back up now to Max Spokes' question. I don't know if you've had a chance to read it in the chat. This is from an undergraduate doing a dissertation on natural history collection undertaken by Alfred Russel Wallace and Evelyn Cheeseman. He is interested to know if Q has a definition of what it means by exploitative legacies, and if you include unequal or unremunerated knowledge transfer as extraction of wealth.
So we don't have a definition, is what I would say at the moment, but I would consider those, yes, the latter part of that question. And I would take it to mean where there has been an unequal benefits resulting from the collection or the knowledge that's created by that collection. That's how I would currently sort of think of exploitative legacies. I hope that helps to clarify a little. But it's certainly something, I think one of the things we're thinking of doing is kind of having a bibliography and a kind of terminology list that we can refer to, so that we understand that everyone sort of understands these terms in the same way, or where we're coming from. And that'd be a really useful tool for us to have, definitely. Thank
you. So a second question also for Kat from Helen Winning. Are asking about the balance between actively collecting in a way that will
yes.
better represent hidden stories, or is the focus more on reinterpreting what you have already?
I think both are very important. We sort of need to do a survey to understand more about what we currently hold, but we're certainly looking for more examples. So active collecting is something we will definitely consider. But we are also thinking about readdressing. So both are really critical. And it's just a case of resource and further research. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So there was another question for Abby. This is from John Mason. I saw the count of 54 individuals of Native American background in your survey. There's an interest in how they might be represented in the archive, and particularly on their rights, how their rights and interests might intersect with the local work represented in the archive. For example, about the use of land for hunting.
Sure, thank you, John. That's a great question. What you were looking at with that little line graph is a smidgen of our output in the audit that we're doing at the moment. Most of the collections that address Native Americans are not in the conservation collection. They're profoundly absent from the conservation collection. So I can speak more broadly about where they are included, since that's what you asked about. Lots of photographic collections, taken, images by photographers who were not Native people, but also accounts of settlers and early residents of Western states and cities and towns and prairies as they were colonizing essentially the Western Plains and encountering people that they hadn't met before who were Native people. So there are some perspectives, but they're largely from an Anglo perspective, where I think we have some interesting intersection with Native people is honestly in some of our social justice related collections about the Chicano movement in the West, where there were alliances with Chicano activists and American Indian movement activists. So there's some interesting material there. To kind of get at this idea of how can we make this material more available, I think the answer is sometimes not to go out and collect it or to gain trust with every community and begin to mine more collections for our institutions. I think a lot of it is to equalize institutions' ability to contribute material to union catalogs, union digital databases. Things that are exciting, I think, are the Digital Public Library of America, where any institution can contribute some digital content that will then link back to their database and bring people in who may not have otherwise been able to locate that interesting research material. So we can't all do it all. We'd all love to be able to do everything well and collect every community's material beautifully. But since we can't do that, I think there's a lot of different forces at work and ways that we should be highlighting what we do have, sometimes finding it in unlikely places, and then helping institutions of every size to be able to contribute and make their material available.
Thank you. I think I have noticed all the questions in chat. Is there anything anyone thinks I've missed? And thank you for the comments in the chat as well about the everyone seems to have also found the speakers in the sessions very enriching and interesting. So I think as we are past the time, perhaps we should come to an end there. This is just the start of History Day. From 12:30, there is a live stream. I think there will be a link somewhere, probably on the website, of different videos that have been put together by participating organisations. And then in the afternoon, there's a second session at 3 on collecting nature memories, an interactive workshop, which explores how history and memory is formed by our natural environment. So I encourage you to attend the other parts of this day, and thank you all very much. Thank you to our speakers. Perhaps we can all come in to do this. Thank our speakers, and thanks everyone for joining.